This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. You can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. This is a great collection of books about animal studies and it covers the whole disciplinary range of animal studies. They're currently accepting proposals, so if you're working on a book about animals, consider getting in touch with the editors or with the press to talk to them about whether your work might be a good fit. Also, a really quick shout out to Elizabeth Usher, who provided the updated theme tune for Knowing Animals. You can learn more about Elizabeth at veganthused.com. Now today I'm very pleased to introduce you to someone with whom I have a rather surprising connection. We've co-authored a paper, but we've never actually met in person. My guest is Dr Christopher Bobier. Chris is an assistant professor of philosophy at St Mary's University in Minnesota, where he's also the associate director of the Hendrickson Institute for Ethical Leadership. Among other things, his research concerns ethics, including lots of work on animal and food ethics. Today, we're going to talk about his collection, New Omnivorism and Strict Veganism, Critical Perspectives, especially his chapter, New Omnivore Policy, Friend or Foe of Veganism. The book, which Chris co-edited with Dr Cheryl Abbate, was released in 2023 by Routledge. Welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Thank you for having me.
Could you start by telling us what led you to work on veganism and new omnivorism?
Back in 2003, Stephen Davis published a paper in which he argued that a strong pro-animal rights position, if you want to take it consistently, if you want to be consistent in that, you should eat some animals. And I remember when I first read that paper thinking, wow, that's amazing. Not because I agreed with him. In fact, I disagreed with him on almost everything he said. But what he did for me was he raised the observation that for lack of a better term, plant agriculture kills a lot of animals intentionally and unintentionally. So pesticide sales worldwide is growing year over year, and pesticides are used at every stage, right? To harvest, to store, right? In businesses and houses and warehouses. And so that really raises, or sort of it raised to the forefront of my mind that vegan diets are not without blood on their hands, contrary to what I want, what I would hope is the case. And so after reading Davis and then after reading authors like Bob Fisher, who argue that there's a gap between arguing that factory farming, industrialized animal agriculture is problematic. I think we all can agree, or most people can agree, that it's deeply problematic. But it doesn't go from the wrongness of that to the obligatoriness of adopting a strict plant-based diet, right? There's other options on the table, so to speak. So really, I think what we saw in the animal ethics literature from Davis's 2003 article onward is a growth in exploiting this gap, right? Industrialized animal agriculture is wrong. Doesn't necessarily entail strict veganism, right? What about like eating insentient animals, right? Like insects. What about roadkill? Or as you've written on, freeganism, right? A leftover turkey sandwich when nobody else is around to eat it. So really this book is an outgrowth in that, right? Of saying, hey, here's new omnivorism. And here are sort of the ways that we can, explore dietary options for those of us who care a lot about animals.
So are there actually new omnivores out there? Are there actually people who care deeply about animals, but who choose not to eat a vegan diet, but to instead eat these kinds of exceptional animal products?
Yeah, I think it's important to distinguish individuals who defend a new omnivore position and those who are committed new omnivores. Bruckner, in his article, in his chapter contribution, where he's like, if you're a strict vegan, you should eat roadkill. There's no indication that he thinks he should be eating that, right? It's more of just like a response to vegans. But I am of the view, so I'm a practicing vegan myself, but I am of the view that I should eat some animal products. Now, I'm a practicing vegan because even though I live in an area where there's a lot of roadkill, for instance, I never actually come across any roadkill that I can harvest. I always see like a bloated, dead deer on the side of the road. I haven't seen any leftover turkey sandwiches, edible insects, right? Like I just don't have access to these things. So I think practically speaking, for a majority of people, somebody who seriously is a new omnivore is a practicing vegan. Now, that said, if I do come across a turkey sandwich, I don't know how appealing it would be. And I would personally try to find somebody else to eat it who's a meat eater themselves. But I wouldn't be opposed to it, if that makes sense.
So why do you think we need, given what you're saying about the kind of closeness of new omnivorism and veganism in practice, why do you think we need a book-length exploration of new omnivorism?
Yeah, in fact, this actually ties into the chapter that I wrote nicely, because for listeners who may not know, Josh and I co-authored a paper in the journal Food Ethics introducing new omnivorism, right? And in that paper, Josh, you and I argued that new omnivorism is a novel and it's new, right? It's a novel position in food ethics, animal ethics, and it's recent. And what we did in that paper is, I was looking at it the other day, it's an incredible paper, we did great, is we contrasted new omnivorism with other forms of carnivorism, right? So like other, let's eat animal positions. So like humane carnivorism, right? Compassionate carnivorism, right? These positions in the animal ethics literature, which say we should eat animals or raise and kill animals for food because it's in their best interest. And we said, like, that's not what new omnivorism is. New omnivorism is the view that animals matter. We should care. We should care. We should love. We should be pro-animal. But given the amount of suffering and death that we cause animals in growing plants for our vegan diets, we should be open to the possibility of eating that. So the way that this chapter, my chapter, New Omnivore Policy, Friend or Foe of Veganism, the way I intentionally framed it is, let's compare new omnivorism with strict veganism, right? Because I think, the way that I understand it, I think you agree with it. Let me know if you're wrong, or if I'm wrong, because chances are I may be. That new omnivorism, as I understand it, is an outgrowth of strict veganism. In other words, it's a strict vegans who really, really love animals, care about animals, but take seriously the amount of harm that we cause them when we when we intentionally kill them, who threaten our crops. And so really what I try to do in this paper is really highlight that vegan philosophy, vegan practice really is very similar to new omnivore policy and practice. And indeed, I say somewhere in that paper that, look, practically speaking, as I've already mentioned, new omnivores, I suspect, are practicing vegans. Right? Because how often do we come across harvestable roadkill that we don't have another better option to do with? And so really it's an exploration, right? So new omnivores, like strict vegans, are going to be strongly opposed to industrialized animal agriculture. But new omnivores are also going to be in favor of pursuing alternatives to rampant pesticide use. Now, strict vegans are not opposed to that, and I think all that I talk to they're also in favor of that. It just so happens, right, that usually my sense is many strict vegans, right, we emphasize the wrongness of raising and killing animals, the wrongness of industrialized and humane farming, animal farming, and we focus less on plant agriculture, arable agriculture.
So if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that new omnivores aren't so much saying to vegans, oh, you should be eating these products in the style of the Bruckner paper you mentioned earlier, but perhaps what they should instead be doing is saying, hey, let's pay some attention to these animal harms that you might be overlooking in plant agriculture.
Yeah, and let's reflect on what our commitment to animals requires of us in response to that. So one thing I know, this is an observation on my part, when I read figures like Tom Regan, Gary Francone, and others who mention the harms that befall animals in arable agriculture, plant agriculture, it's usually put to the side as though a lot of it is accidental. And that, I think that's true, right? There's a lot of accidental harm that befalls animals. But I think there's also a case to be made that there's also a lot of intentional harm, right? Farmers go to great lengths to protect their crops from anything that threatens it, which is why we see pesticide sales growing, increasing the year over year worldwide. So for those of us who really love animals, we need to recognize and take seriously that when we have a yummy vegetarian, vegan plate before us, there's a lot of blood that was shed to get that plate before us. And so we need to really re-examine and reflect on dietary practices. I think we're becoming more and more aware of that.
So what kind of practical steps are open to us, either as individuals or as communities, to push back against this and to limit the harm that arable or plant agriculture causes to animals?
The couple of the suggestions that I make in my chapter, which is focused on the U.S., would be things like, there's this thing in the United States called the Farm Bill, that it gets passed every couple of years, and it creates a lot of provisions and financial incentives to farmers. It overwhelmingly supports the planting of corn and soy. It does not incentivize planting vegetable, other legumes, right? Like it, and so we have in the United States a broken system where farmers are growing incredible amounts of corn and soy, incredible amounts. And yet when I go to the supermarket down the street and I look, and I walk through various aisles, it's so much cheaper to buy like a pound of beef than it is to buy a pound of broccoli. And so we need to find ways at the governmental level, I think, but there's also other ways of writing that balance, right? It shouldn't be cheaper to buy highly processed foods or other unhealthy foods, sugary foods, than it is to buy carrots and broccoli and spinach and kale. So I think it begins there. And also there's other things where we need to support efforts away from rampant pesticide and fertilizer use. So there's a couple programs in place that are growing, like cover crops is one example, right? We need to really pull back the sheer scale of pesticide and fertilizer use, which I go into in my paper, but I won't bore anybody here.
Do you think we can ever eliminate harm to animals in arable agriculture? Or is it always going to be a degree of harm to them?
On the scale at which 9 billion people need to eat, no. But that's different from the local level. And here's what I mean. I think a lot of us can do a lot more to grow in a safe to animals way food. But at the systematic level where we're talking about we need to grow enough food to feed 10 billion people, I don't think so. I think the best we can hope for and work towards is one where we minimize as much as possible. And there are good ways to do it. But I think the best I can hope for in this world is a system of arable agriculture that doesn't cause as much harm as it currently does. So here's the concrete example: biodegradable pesticides. Right? There are certain forms of pesticides that are specifically targeted to be harmless to animals. So like they're more expensive right now, but if we can replace current pesticides that are indiscriminate and cause immense environmental problems, if we can replace that with targeted pesticides that are degradable and are harmless to animals, that would be an incredible win for our waterways, for our land, for the animals.
When you say pesticides that are harmless to animals, do you mean they are targeting plant pests, or do you mean that they're harmless to animals other than the ones that they target? What do you mean by that?
There's some work being done on pesticides that are natural, right? They're naturally occurring. They're natural repellents to the insects and the fungi, like the bacteria or whatever that threatens, say, a corn crop. But because they're naturally occurring, they're more or less, they've been shown to be harmless to you and me and other animals when we eat them. So they don't pose a threat the way that, like, in the 1960s, DDT posed to you and me and field animals when we ingested it. And so I think that's one way that we can go, right? If governments can incentivize and promote that as an alternative to the pesticides that are currently used, that, again, when the rains happen, they go in the water, they go down, we have massive dead zones, birds, fish, we all know this. I assume, listeners to this know this. If we can get away from that, I think the world will be so much better for everybody.
So as you've said, these kinds of proposals regarding pesticides are going to be welcomed by both new omnivores and vegans. But I suppose I'd quite like to push you on whether there might be some other new omnivore policies that lots of vegans are going to be quite nervous about. Because, of course, by definition, new omnivores are open to some non-vegan foodstuffs. So you've mentioned non-sentient animals or plausibly non-sentient animals. You've mentioned roadkill. We might also talk about new biotechnological means of producing food. Do you think new omnivore policy might diverge quite strongly from vegan policy when it comes to these products?
Yes. Let's focus on roadkill. There are certain states in the United States where, in order to harvest roadkill, you need the written permission of a police officer, but you also need a hunting license. Now, I think that's overly restrictive. I think that so I don't hunt, so I don't have a hunting license. But if I get into an accident or I see an accident and there's a freshly killed deer right there, I think I should be allowed to harvest the flesh of that animal. And here's why. If I can harvest the flesh, I can take that meat to the local zoo. That local zoo buys an immense amount of animal products from industrialized animal agriculture because they need to feed their lions, their tigers, and all of that, right? So if I can bring a whole deer to that zoo, they don't have to buy, in theory, as much from there. Thereby, they reduce the amount of animals that are slaughtered, in theory, by industrialized animal agriculture. And I think that's great. I think we can all be open to that. I think we should be open to that. I think there's a breakdown that I mentioned in my chapter between some of the things that a new omnivore would be in favor and a strict vegan wouldn't. But I also think we need to keep this in perspective, right? To emphasize the similarity that I see between new omnivorism and strict vegans. But the new omnivore is against industrialized animal agriculture. Like, we want that gone. We think that's a terrible scourge on the earth. And the strict vegan agrees, right? Like, we're working towards the same thing. And this is the big thing, just given the scale and the costs associated with it, moral, environmental, and so on. As a new omnivore, I'm against industrialized animal agriculture. And that occupies a lot more of my time than, here's a little reform on, roadkill harvesting here and there. So I think we need to keep these in perspective, that it's not as opposed, right? There's a lot more overlap. There's a lot more friendly collaboration going on than it might seem.
Yeah, and so given that the new omnivore is opposed to industrialized animal agriculture and perhaps even smaller scale animal agriculture, it's kind of much closer to veganism than other forms of what we might call omnivore or omnivory.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Again, I think from strict veganism, if you take strict veganism plus an honest, open appreciation of the amount of animal harm, suffering, and death caused by producing a strict vegan diet, I think you get new omnivorism. New omnivorism doesn't, for me, grow out of a love of eating animals. It grows out of a love of animals. And we see this going back to the 2003 article with Stephen Davis, where he begins with, take your animal rights position, you should eat animals. I view new omnivorism as a close cousin to strict veganism. And I don't see them as that opposite.
But that's not necessarily the view taken up by some authors in the book, right? So could you tell us a bit about what the book covers beyond your chapter?
New omnivorism is an emerging field, I think, or an emerging position, and there's a lot of variety within it. So here an example I'll give is Andy Lamian, his book, Duty and the Beast, Should We Eat Meat in the Name of Animal Rights? He's the one who actually coined the term new omnivorism. And the book is largely critical of arguments for eating roadkill, arguments for hunting, arguments for eating insects. Like, he explains new omnivorism and then he criticizes it from a strict vegan point of view. And yet when he comes to discuss in vitro meat, he's open to it, right? Like he's not so critical of it, but as a strict vegan himself, he's in favor of it, or at least open to the ethical defensibility of eating in vitro meat. And I think that highlights the beauty of the ongoing debate. So in this book, we have chapters on genetically disenhancing animals. We have chapters on eating insects, plausibly insentient insects. Chapters on roadkill, chapters on fishing, chapters on eating freegan. So that would be your chapter, Josh, in which you argue that it's, mostly the case is pretty strong that if there's a leftover turkey sandwich, nobody else is around to eat it. No one else is around to see you eat it. And there's no other option. You can eat it.
I should say that my position is quite like yours in that I am an ethical vegan. I'm quite committed to my veganism, but I find the case for certain new omnivore practices to be quite difficult to answer. And I know that Cheryl Abbate, for example, might be annoyed to hear us two talking like this because she's of the view that actually many of these practices are not defensible, that we shouldn't be eating these products, even if on the face of it, no harm to animals is being committed.
Yeah. And so let me be fair to some of the objections, right? So an objection to new omnivorism is that we're complicit, right? That eating, even though I'm not financially contributing to industrialized animal agriculture, when I eat a leftover turkey sandwich, I'm being complicit, retroactively endorsing those practices that led to its production. That's one objection. Another objection that we see is for strict vegans, animals fall out of the edibility category, right? They're like grandma. Animals are things that are not to be eaten. So if grandma gets hit, by a car and dies, I shouldn't go and harvest her flesh to eat. So also, it is the case with the deer. And I think there's an objection, there's a compelling objection somewhere in there to be teased out. But on the whole, I still worry about the world we live in. The world we live in is, if anything, we can all agree that the world we live in is broken and in need of radical change.
Do you think this book will lead to further debate between vegans and new omnivores, or do you think that people are going to read it and think that actually these positions are quite close together?
My hope is both and. There's an ongoing literature that's continuing to grow on these and related issues not covered by the book. But I also want people to see, right, along the way that there's a lot of similarity and overlap between new omnivorism and strict veganism. That yes, we disagree and we argue and there's clear lines of disagreement and there's arguments to be made for and against and responses and and what a beautiful introduction to animal ethics, really. But at the end of the day, we all care about animals and we all want a better world for animals. And we're debating about really how do we inhabit the world that we are currently inhabit with regard to animals.
Well, that seems like a great note to end the first part of our conversation on, and perhaps to turn to our regular 5 quick questions. So are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I am.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
James Rachel's Basic Argument for Vegetarianism. It was incredible.
And can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
So I taught a class in 2019 on food ethics, and I had students read Timothy Hassau's defense of factory farming. And the only defense of factory farming I could find, but I remember reading it with my students, and we all were not impressed. And so I wrote a response to that titled Varieties of the Cruelty-Based Objection to Factory Farming, in which I argued that there's a whole bunch of arguments that he just doesn't even respond to. So that was my first pro-animal scholarship.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Peter Singer. I bet everybody on this podcast says that, or, a name like it, because Animal Liberation was and remains an incredibly powerful book for me.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
For me, I think the answer is to engage our students, right? Those that we interact with, in reflection on animals, but with love, right? And here's what I mean. Like, I try to walk alongside my students and help them reflect on their dietary choices in a way, though, that is welcoming and inviting, but also challenging. And I think that's one of the most important things. Academics have incredible power in the classroom, and I think we can use that for good.
Incidentally, I've always found that new omnivorism, or near relations of new omnivorism, are absolutely fantastic for challenging our vegan students as well. Because I think some people imagine coming into my class, if they know anything about me, that we'll talk about veganism and they have to argue in favor of veganism. And then I'll start talking about roadkill. I'll start talking about leftovers. And suddenly, even the vegan students are feeling a little uneasy.
In my experience, and it's probably the same in yours, students have a dietary practice. They have a dietary philosophy. They have a philosophy about animals, but most of them haven't really thought about it. And so we have an incredible opportunity to invite them into reflection and really sort of poke at inconsistencies or tensions, right? Or challenge them. And I think that is the most important thing we can do.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
End industrialized animal agriculture. But I think beyond that, I think we need to, I would love to see a plant-based vegan diet be sold as appealing, exciting, delicious as standard, right? So in the American context in particular, there's this, cultural assumption that I've seen in many interactions that a well-rounded meal has to have some animal protein. And there's a general consensus or sort of a general assumption against the deliciousness of vegan dishes. And I think vegan organizations can do and should do a lot more to sell not just what they're against, but also making the positive case of, this is incredible, this is delicious, you will be healthier, you will be happier, and selling them on that. So I would love to see how we view our dietary choices shift away from the default animal protein to a default of plants.
What are you working on next?
So a paper on complicity, whether or not new omnivores are in fact complicit when, say, we eat a turkey sandwich that was left over. And so that paper really explores the moral tragedy that I think we find ourselves in.
How can people find out more about your work?
So I have a website, ChristopherBobier.com, but also email me. I'm happy to reach out and talk over email or even Zoom.
Well, thanks so much, Chris, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals, and we're on Facebook at Knowing Animals. I'm on Twitter, or I should say X, at Josh L. Milburn, and I'm on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Please do spread the word about Knowing Animals. Review the podcast where you found it. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.